Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. Over the past 4 months, northern Michigan has been going through it. In March, an ice storm caused tens of thousands of utility customers to lose power. In April, record-breaking precipitation caused rivers and lakes to flood, ripping apart roads. Now, smoke from Canadian and Minnesota wildfires has been creating air quality alerts. Before the smoke blew to Metro Detroit, it hit northern Michigan first, choking that part of the state with a blanket of smoke. In other words, climate change is affecting all of us. But depending on where you're located, the effects can vary. So, what are things like for residents of northern Michigan right now? Vivian Law is a climate solutions reporter for Interlochen Public Radio and Grist. She spoke about all this with the Metro's Sam Corey.
In Detroit on Thursday, we had, according to some reporting, the worst air quality in the world. Northern Michigan got hit a little bit earlier than us on Wednesday. What did it feel like in northern Michigan on Wednesday before the smoke came down here?
Yeah, it was incredibly hazy. And, in the early morning, you really couldn't see anything. And then literally by the afternoon, a haze had settled over most of, any sort of, I'm on a summer camp, so you can really see past like the lake that's nearby. You could smell kind of like the scent of like burning tires or like burnt wood in the air. It kind of came on pretty quickly, and we were kind of watching what was happening in the UP because we knew that stuff was drifting towards us like a little bit later.
What were people doing to protect themselves and stay safe?
It's kind of tough, I think, with wildfire smoke. Some of it is out of your control considering these are wildfires burning hundreds of miles away. But, there were some local governments handing out like N95 masks. There were local officials kind of giving out guidance about how to best like turn on your air conditioner or like check your filters. Just a lot of kind of precautionary measures. But again, there's only so much you can do, especially given the sheer spread of this. There's not anything super practical to do besides, make sure you stay inside, clean your air filter, keep the air circulating.
I wonder how many people are taking it seriously at all. I know here the air quality is bad today. We're speaking on Friday, and there are folks who are just not wearing masks, who are pretty cavalier about everything. And maybe that's just because this is a relatively new phenomenon for folks. But I wonder what it's like up in northern Michigan. Are there people who, they're just like, there's a little smoke, I'll get through it. It's not really a reason to be cautious.
I think you'll definitely see a little bit of both. You see people walking around who have to be outside with, thick respirator masks on. And then I was talking to someone today who saw somebody still biking like uphill on a road with no mask on. So, it's kind of a mix of like there are people taking it seriously. There's people who I think maybe have become a little desensitized to it, given it has been several days of bad air quality of smoke, and kind of speaks to like some people have normalized some of this stuff. And it's tough too, especially when there was an extreme heat advisory for a couple days on top of the lingering wildfire smoke. So by the time that passed, it's been a little cooler now. I think there's some people who think that, it's cooler outside and that means the smoke is also better because we kind of came on at the same time. So you definitely have a little bit of both ends of the spectrum here in terms of how people are reacting to it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the heat wave because there are a lot of challenges that have been striking northern Michigan. An ice storm in March, tons of rain that caused flooding in April. Now there's smoke from wildfires and poor air quality. There's been a heat wave. Broadly speaking, I'm curious how people understand all of these things together. Do they see them as one-off incidents? Do they say, oh, this is climate change and we need to do something about it? What's the broader narrative running through people's heads in northern Michigan?
I definitely think climate change can be easier to grasp when it comes to the summer danger season. Like we're talking about extreme heat and wildfire smoke that's become worse over the past couple of years. But you're right that, northern Michigan is no stranger to extreme weather events like ice storms, like intense precipitation in the spring. And there's definitely the sense that this is because of our changing climate and not so much one-off moments. I don't know how many times we've had to explain that a 1 in a 500-year flood doesn't actually mean it doesn't happen every 500 years, but you're seeing an increase in just the number of these 1 in 500-year floods that are happening. So people recognize that things are changing. And I think that the storms that we're seeing in spring, the ice storms, that rain, I mean, even some of the intense summer storms we've had too, like there is the recognition that things are different in this kind of new era of a changing climate.
This is a time when climate politics have really not been working like they were a couple years ago. What I mean by that is people are focused a lot more on costs, and Republicans, broadly speaking, have been saying that transitioning to clean energy will cost people more money. That's certainly true in the state legislature in Michigan. Northern Michigan has more rural and often more conservative residents. What does climate politics broadly look like up there? Is there skepticism about climate change? Is there skepticism about transitioning to cleaner energy? Or do people embrace these things?
I definitely think rural communities up here are not a monolith, and there's a lot of diversity in terms of thoughts about climate, thoughts about, clean energy policy. And so it's a mix as with any other place. But I do think, like we were talking about earlier, there's is this growing awareness that things are different than they were like 20, 30 years ago in terms of climate. When I talk to farmers up here, like there may be some disagreement on like what's causing the climate to change, but people are in general consensus that things are shifting, and how they relate to clean energy policy is still kind of a thorny thing to parse out, especially given, the landscape of some state policies that have shifted how local communities think about clean energy policy, and this kind of push by the state anyway to see more renewable energy come onto the grid. So there is still some, uncertainty about solar up here in northern Michigan, given the kind of minimal sun that we get in the winter.
I'm glad you brought up solar because that's become a really big topic in Michigan and particularly in northern Michigan because a few years ago, the state passed a law which prevents local residents from outright blocking large-scale solar farms. What does this look like in northern Michigan?
Yeah, I've been reporting on a project up here that's been proposed in Wexford County. And, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of anger. It's a pretty complicated web of issues here in terms of farmers are scared about losing farmland. They're concerned about this general trend of farmland being lost to development, mixed with some confusion and uncertainty about how beneficial solar would be in a region that doesn't see a lot of sun, and just questions about this new law that you've mentioned, Public Act 233, which does limit the ability of local governments to outright reject large scale renewable energy projects.
I guess I wonder what is behind the confusion. How much of it is people not being familiar with the technology, people feeling like they don't have control over their power or their energy source? And how much of it is people taking in information from conservative politicians in the state who are saying we shouldn't transition to clean energy, and in fact, that's going to increase costs? I'm specifically thinking about House Speaker Matt Hall. What is sort of the influence? What's causing the confusion?
Yeah, I think it would look a little different depending on who you talk to. And I think a lot of it boils down to like there's a lot of change happening at once and a lot of uncertainty about, what that means for communities, whether that is big, large renewable energy projects or it's potential proposals about data centers. There's a lot of things happening and moving quickly that people have a little bit of hesitancy about, how this will impact their community. So I do think it's a little bit of all of that. It's where people are getting their information. It's questions about how this will affect their local community that, maybe has been really reliant on one industry for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, changes to our energy system translates to really big changes. I mean, one, the literal source of the energy changes, but also having big solar fields changes the aesthetics and the feel of a place. It's also a different system to put your trust into. What are people telling you about the assistance they need to get along with the change, to move with the change instead of fighting it? What do people feel like they're missing?
Yeah, I think it kind of comes down to like what a community wants from a developer, like, one that's developing a large scale utility sized solar farm. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the potential for community benefits agreements to bring, funding to schools or to upgrade infrastructure. So I think there's definitely ways in which some of this stuff can be a little bit easier to digest. At the same time, there's still a lot of conflict because some people will still say that this shouldn't even be here in the first place.
There's not that much that governments can do in terms of combating poor air quality when the smoke comes billowing in. But I do wonder, I mean, one of the things outside of changing filtration systems and investing a lot more in those is that we could in the state and certainly around the country transition just faster to clean energy sources like wind and solar. And in doing that, that would actually make the air around us cleaner. I do wonder if anybody in northern Michigan is making that case that we should transition, that we need to be transitioning just for the clean air.
Yeah, no, that's totally what's been happening here in these communities. And I talked to the founder for Michigan Coalition for Climate Action, and she did make this case where, we can't control the smoke that's flowing into Michigan, but we can mitigate potentially worse impacts down the line by like transitioning quicker to clean energy sources because fossil fuel generation and fossil fuel use is contributing to these kind of hotter temperatures and the drier conditions that ultimately is making wildfires like what we're seeing in Minnesota and Canada more common and more widespread.
Wait, I
So it
understand that
is
you're
kind
hearing from
yeah,
advocates. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But I do wonder if you're hearing
yeah.
from any locals and residents and maybe even politicians at the city level who are not necessarily affiliated with a climate group.
People have made those connections, but again, I don't know. This is kind of the perennial problem with addressing climate change is that it's easy to talk about this stuff when it comes to extreme weather and the stuff is in your face. But actually translating words into action is a little bit harder. So there are utilities here in Traverse City that already have goals of reaching certain renewable clean energy milestones by a certain time. So people are proactively thinking about that, but it does take more than just your local municipality to enact system-wide change on a level that impacts more than just Traverse City.
It's the Metro on WDT Detroit Public Radio. I'm Sam Corey, and I'm speaking with Vivian Law. She's a climate solutions reporter for Interlochen Public Radio. Amid smoke causing poor air quality and continuing climate emergencies in northern Michigan, we're discussing how residents are adapting to climate change and how they're not. Vivian, in March, ice storms downed power lines and caused power outages. And then in April, there was flooding that really affected a lot of the infrastructure in northern Michigan. How are people and towns recovering from these events?
Yeah, I think people are still picking up the pieces. We had the flooding in April, but even just last month, there was extreme rainfall in Northport, which is just north of Traverse City on the Leelanau Peninsula, that experienced some pretty horrific extreme rain events that, flooded streets and all that. So it becomes a kind of like constant upkeep almost with all the extreme weather events that are happening. And I think there is this growing question of every time there is some sort of extreme weather event, whether that's an ice storm or whether that's intense snow or intense rain, of what can we do to better prepare. And, I've done reporting on, whether burying power lines is a solution or how we can upgrade old aging dams in the region. But the takeaway from all of that is that our systems are old. Our electricity distributions are old. It's hard to keep up with worsening extreme weather. And it's become the problem of whether we invest upfront for extremes, which is expensive, or do people risk letting it play out and kind of upgrade piecemeal after each extreme weather event.
What I hear you saying is that in order to get in front of these problems, as you said, it's going to cost a lot of money. And that's got to come from the state and federal government. And that does mean that local officials and then state officials will really need to be pushing for this, at least somewhat in lockstep.
It doesn't necessarily have to come from state and federal government. There are potentially private philanthropic sources out there, but I do agree that I think the bulk of it does have to come from state and federal sources potentially.
More ice storms, which happened in March in northern Michigan, could give people more reason to rely more on their own energy, what they generate on their rooftops from solar power and then store in batteries. Are folks starting to turn to rooftop solar as power outages have become more common?
I think there's definitely a growing recognition that energy dependence, especially in a time where reliability might be decreasing because of extreme events. That's definitely growing. I mean, we have an example, East Bay Township just updated their zoning. That's the township that encompasses part of Traverse City and kind of sits in Grand Traverse County. But their township updated their zoning ordinance last year to better accommodate potential residents who want to install like rooftop solar or, small renewable energy systems. So there is a growing recognition that people are interested in this thing.
I guess in closing here, a few years ago, people were floating the idea that northern Michigan could be a safe haven from climate change, a sort of refuge from big storms and big weather events. I'm wondering if anyone speaks up there about that now.
Yeah, I think people are in agreement that northern Michigan is relatively safer than maybe other parts of the state or other parts of the country. But I think the reality is that no one area of the world, of the country, will be completely immune to the effects. And that is something I've heard reflected from residents I talk to doctors, to, health experts, and, even people who work in insurance. So I think northern Michigan is relatively safer compared to Florida, where you see hurricanes, or even like mid-Michigan, where tornadoes happen a lot during the summer. But I think this question of whether northern Michigan is a climate haven is one that pops up a lot. But a general answer I hear from a lot of folks is that no place is safe from the effects of climate change, and especially not northern Michigan.
Vivian Law is a climate solutions reporter for Interlochen Public Radio and Grist. She spoke with the Metro's Sam Corey. Coming up here on the Metro, what does it mean to be patriotic if you feel some kind of way about America right now? We'll dive into that next. Stay with us.